Hello and welcome to Business Day TV's climate special ahead of the COP30 summit, where critical global climate issues will be in the spotlight. I'm Ntaoleng Lechela. Now, it's no secret that Africa contributes to only roughly 4% of global emissions, yet the continent bears the brunt of climate policies. Green energy transition will cost the continent billions of dollars, with South Africa's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan alone pegged at $97 billion. It becomes a funding issue. Let's talk climate finance from an African perspective. And with me in studio is Mbombo Luhembe, Sustainability Strategy Lead at ABSA Group, and via Zoom, Thandolwethu Lukuko, Executive Director of Climate Services Consultancy, Mansa Advisory, and Karishma Pulia, Senior Climate Risk Analyst for Shareholder Activism Group, Just Share. Thando, Karishma, Mbombo, thanks so much for joining us today. Now, across the continent, we still see a lot of climate misinformation, whether it's denialism, whether it's confusion about carbon markets, or uncertainty about what climate finance really does. Thando, I'll start with you, with your work around advocacy and how misinformation has perhaps affected the sense of urgency when it comes to climate financing.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me on the show. I think the subject of climate financing, particularly as it relates to urgency, cannot be understated enough. We've come to understand that climate impacts are increasing every single year. Every year, new records are being set. But what we continuously are seeing is that the quantum or the amount of financing that's needed to address climate is continuously falling short. Last year, when we were COP29, what we saw was that going into COP, we wanted an amount of $1.3 trillion that would allow us to be able to adequately, or not adequately, but address climate financing and climate needs around the continent and certainly around the world. But the number that was finally agreed to at the end of COP was 300 billion, which is a third of what it is that we needed, or a quarter rather. And so it begs the question, do we really want to address this issue with the urgency that it requires if we're not going to be putting our money where our mouths are? And so to that degree, you know, it's one can be said to that, you know, the powers that be, as it were, do not find this issue as serious enough to mobilize the necessary resources in a time frame that allows us to be able to address it, at least until before 2030, to make significant actions.
Just to bring Karishma into the conversation, we speak around, you know, the urgency when it comes to these pleasures, when it comes to some of the financing. Do you think maybe part of the challenge here is that a lot of climate finance language perhaps feels inaccessible?
I think that's maybe a little bit disingenuous. I feel, if anything, the climate finance language is quite clear, albeit quite complicated. So when we look at that funding gap that needs to be bridged, we need to look at where we need that capital to come from. And we're still looking at capital primarily coming from international markets, which is valid, but there's a whole lot of private capital sitting within Africa that could be harnessed to also start looking at funding that gap. And as a civil society organization looking at the corporate sector, we think that the private sector could be doing a lot more around releasing funding into capital markets to kind of bridge that funding gap. So I think the challenge is less about the complexity or the inaccessibility of the language and more about the intent and the kind of risk appetite that people approach it with.
Mbombo, Karishma there speaks of the funding gap and the private sector playing a bigger role in filling that gap. Perhaps from, you know, ABSA's side, maybe talk to me about the obstacles when it comes to financing some of these climate projects in the African continent.
No, thank you, and good afternoon to all the listeners. I will start by saying that as an organization, ABSA really understands the urgency of climate funding. We were the first bank in 2021 to go out with a funding commitment of 100 billion by the year 2025, which is a commitment that we completed and achieved a year before and even exceeded that. So from a commitment perspective, we fully understand that. And in terms of the challenges, I think one of the challenges will be the trade-off and the tension between short-term and long-term objectives when it comes to funding. A lot of organizations, you know, when you look at sustainability, it talks about long-term priorities. And a lot of organizations are dealing with short-term urgencies. So you do have that. You also do have regulation. Regulation plays a big role. If you look at a sector such as automotive, you need a lot of regulation to support such a sector, which is regulation that you don't normally always find on the African continent. And also sustainability requires certain infrastructure. Again, in a sector such as automobile, you look at EV vehicle, you need good roads for that. So the problem is quite complex. It's not just about pouring funding into a problem, but it's got a lot of complexity that need to be addressed as well.
And just sticking with you, right, you speak about some of these long-term and short-term projects, and that one of the biggest problems here is also funding infrastructure. When looking at financing projects, and maybe we can even speak on behalf of the role that DFIs then play as well, in terms of the source of funding. What Africa really needs is investment and not loans, right?
Yeah, definitely. We need investment and not loans. And we also need to understand that sustainable finance requires new form of information data. Most of organizations, including banks, we are used to financial data from your income statement, your balance sheet. A lot of the DFI look at impact metric. You know, how many jobs you create, for instance, from a loan, how many employment you create. And it is a new muscle, a new capability that many financial organizations and also the entities we are funding needs to create. So there is data as a challenge because you need to provide that to the DFI to demonstrate that it's not just money we are putting into a problem, but we are really solving for real problem and able to evidence the impact that we have in the different communities.
And Thando, I'd like to bring you back in the conversation here. Mbombo mentions the issue around impact, and the actual impact this financing has also depends on whether communities can actually benefit, right? We've seen some cases where money is being poured in, but it doesn't necessarily filter through to the ground. How do we make sure that climate finance mechanisms, whether it's carbon trading or funding, actually supports the resilience in those vulnerable communities?
To some degree, we have to ensure that those communities that are most affected have an opportunity to be able to participate, not only in the decision making around the quantums that are needed for the financing, but also how that financing will be used. Typically, what may work is having some kind of intermediary body. This could be through a philanthropy, for instance, that allows those communities to then engage and participate in the decision-making process through their level of support, so that they can inform where exactly some of this financing would need to go. In some instances, you know, it's not necessary that huge amounts of money would be needed to set up or support a corporation. It's really to be able to address the very much lived experiences that a person would get or experience in their own village or in their own hometown. If you look at what happened in Durban, for instance, those communities that were affected when the floods happened would need to have a very easy access, if you will, to the financing that would allow them to be able to rebuild. Typically, you'd find that either organizations or institutions that are set up to help these organizations are not readily available to allow these organizations, particularly as community-based structures or even NGO level, to participate adequately in these decisions. And so it helps to have an intermediary body that can play kind of a supportive role to ensure that finance does reach its intended targets at the end.
You know, you mentioned an intermediary body, and you touched on perhaps that being pushed through by an NGO. Do you perhaps think that maybe regulators can play a role in that, so that we also have, I guess, a more cohesive stance when it comes to climate financing and protecting communities in the continent, speak in one voice?
100%. I do think, you know, one of the things that as South Africa we've championed, and I think we're probably globally recognized for, is what we'd call the social dialoguing, right? A place where the different social partners can come together and engage. So NEDLAC is such a space. The role of regulators cannot be understated. However, as a regulator, you're essentially regulating how flows would happen, not necessarily where they go and what they need to address. In order to be able to fully understand that, you would need to have direct engagement with those who are most impacted, so that the decisions that will ultimately be taken are informed, at least in part, by the role of those who are going to be directly affected and who are going to have a role in implementing the solutions that are needed to address some of the climate impacts.
And that brings me to how we are approaching the just energy transition, Thando. Do you think we're truly and fairly inclusive of communities, and communities particular that are, coal communities?
It's interesting that you asked me this because I'm currently traveling through a coal community at the moment. Look, there's parts of it I think that we've done exquisitely well. We've essentially set the groundwork for how engagement across sectors can happen. To say that it's entirely just full stop would be a stretch. I think there's still a lot of opportunities for improvement that one could employ, specifically how then things like capacity building to ensure that the people that you're talking to understand what the decision that they're going to be taking is going to mean and how they might be active in that space. And then increasingly to ensure on a broader scale that if they are going to be accepting financing or agreeing to particular loans, that those loans won't have dire adverse effects for them as a community and the country at large. To that degree, I think there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done, because certainly if you look at what JET-P, for instance, is saying, JET is still about 90% debt. Less than 10% of that is loans. And so we need to adjust those levels to make sure that we can get more concessional loans and specifically more grants that don't carry the debt burden, so that people can actually do more than actually have to cover the debt later.
All right, let's hit pause at this stage. We have to thank Thandolwethu Lukuko, Executive Director of Climate Services Consultancy, Mansa Advisory. We continue with the conversation right after the break.